Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab, sponsored by CPA Practice Advisor, with your hosts, Randy Johnston and Brian Tankersley.
Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab. I'm Randy Johnston with co-host Brian Tankersley. We thought it was time to give you a bit of the AI regulation update. There's been some recent announcements in that, and in particularly, we want to focus on first the earlier podcast, which we think was still correct on the AI announcements, but also on the new ones. So before we get too far into this, we just want to remind you that when you look at the safest AI tools, right now I'm ranking them in the order of Claude being the safest, Copilot the next safest, Perplexity, which I just downgraded, and I may downgrade it further based on some strategy changes. ChatGPT, even when you're on the $30 version, you have to get even higher into the enterprise version to get more safety. And then Gemini and Llama. But when it's popularity rated, ChatGPT, hands down, most recent stats we have is 61% of AI adoption is on ChatGPT, with 14% of those users in India. Copilot just went around Gemini with 14% market share, Gemini at 13% market share. Perplexity, which I prefer as my search engine, is 6.2%, and Claude is running at 3.2%. But interestingly enough, for Claude, 80% of their subscriptions are for businesses, and Claude actually just turned off support for OpenAI, who was using Claude's coding tools to write their OpenAI code. I mean, the serious programmers know that the Claude coding is serious, but
And they also changed their plans some. I just got it because I pay $20 a month to Claude, like I pay to a lot of other folks. And one of the things they actually put some limits on how much code you can generate with their tool, because evidently some people had really been wearing it out with lower end versions than they hoped you would have for that use.
Yeah, but as of the day of recording this particular session with you, all other AI tools are below 1%. So the Llamas and the Groks and the DeepSeeks, and how many hundred do you want me to name? Because, there's a lot of them out there competing, but that's the best share. Now, the reason I bring up the large language models first is a lot of you are quite familiar with those, but we're going to encourage you to listen in on our Agentic AI podcast here in the Accounting Technology Lab, because we believe that large language models can serve as the base, but we think a lot of the practical work is going to get done by agents. Now, driving all of this globally is the regulatory environment. So we just want to remind you of the podcast we recorded from the January of 23 announcements. So Brian, you want to take away on that?
So basically, one of the first things that President Trump did was sign a whole lot of executive orders. You probably saw a lot of that on television, but one of the ones he rescinded was actually President Biden's executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI. And this is one that put a lot of guardrails around AI. I think the Trump administration, and again, the primary focus in the Biden executive order was on safety, and so there was much more government control in it, including sharing of AI models with the government and other things like that. And so this was something again that they wanted to get going in here with it. Again, there was a lot of information on this, but again, this executive order that President Trump issued switched from this safety first to this growth first policy strategy. It incorporated other things as well. But again, the tech firms supported the deregulation. The civil rights and the labor groups raised quite a bit of concerns in here. There is a separate kind of shadow government version of this AI action plan called the People's AI Action Plan, that again is coming out of a lot of the I don't know, the think tanks in DC, that emphasizes more ethical safeguards. Again, the concern here is that we're in an all-out sprint for this, and most of the folks in the current government seem to be more worried about losing and getting behind China and Chinese leadership taking over in this area, as opposed to as opposed to American leadership. And so that's in here. There were also some relaxations. Justin Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, actually successfully lobbied for some relaxed chip export rules and some other things like this. They also provided some support to open source AI. The key milestone here that they were expecting to do that was in this January executive order was the delivery of this federal AI action plan, which actually came out. And I'll turn it over to Randy for that.
Yeah, so that was part of the motivation for today's session. This was released on July 23rd, the America's AI Action Plan, and it really has three main pillars: to accelerate AI innovation, to build the American AI infrastructure, and to lead in international AI diplomacy and security. And each of those three pillars has driving forces behind them. And again, this is a framework, so there's a lot to come on that, but it really a collateral comment I'll make, Brian, is the Economist in late July, early August produced a session or an article, a version, I guess we'll say, analyzing AI in lots of ways, privacy and the like. Now, why do I call that out? Because the writers in there emphasized the concerns about AI being dominated by a government, and whichever government has the dominant position will have a leg up for decades to come, they believe. Now, I don't know if I need to believe all that stuff or not, but I do know that the people with the best AI, whether it's industry, businesses, or governments, are going to be the winners. And in The Economist, they talked about the capital behind AI being a big deal. So, I want to turn us back here to the AI action plan, but I wanted to cite The Economist. If you're a subscriber, that's certainly worth, picking up and making sure that you spend the time to read those. Now, the first pillar was accelerating AI innovation. And Brian, there's a number of things that are cited here. Are there some that you think are worth calling out for our listeners?
I think in general, this is a private sector first approach as opposed to a government regulation first approach. And so it's just a different thing in here. Again, let's stop back and think about our experience with tax authorities and other things like this. Our tax authorities are miracle workers right now, given the technology they have, which is usually 10 plus years old. And so, you think about if the government side of getting notices resolved and all of the other things that happen inside the Internal Revenue Service, selecting audits, doing audits, analyzing transactions, that kind of stuff. If the government sector got AI, it could really be a huge catalyst for things becoming more productive. And so again, there are significant issues in here, worried about protecting free speech, but also about synthetic media and AI generated deepfakes. You and I have seen a number of things. I think in this year's Ripped from the Headlines presentation that we do as part of our tech conferences, I actually have a number of people that have been ripped off by deepfakes, and they are coming for you too, with deepfake video and all kinds of other things like this. But also creating AI-ready scientific data sets and investing in AI-enabled science and supporting manufacturing and making people more literate at this. And again, driving AI adoption in defense, and again, but still protecting it from security risks. And that's one of the hardest things about technology are these ITAR regulations, the International Trade in Arms Regs, because there are certain things that are treated as munitions, like encryption algorithms are treated as munitions. And so the question that I think is open right now is going to be, to what extent are AI algorithms and to what extent are they going to be shareable with people outside the country? And we don't know what the answer to that is. We know that we've had limits on the chips, and those limits are going to be rolled back a little bit, but we're not sure which way it's going to go in here.
Yes, Brian, and as a matter of fact, as we're recording this, I think Jensen Huang from NVIDIA is in the White House today. So there may be some adjustments that we will want to do on that. But the core here is the regulatory environment. And you've really called out the industries here. It's manufacturing, it's government, it's defense, and so forth, getting the leverage and basically trying to keep the regulatory environment out of the way. And so there's some pieces around that. Now, the second pillar was about the American AI infrastructure. Now, we're going to talk more about that towards the end of our time together today. But here they were trying to knock off permitting issues. We have an electric grid, frankly, that can't support AI, which is why we've been talking about nuclear power and other resources in Tech Update this year. Trying to bring manufacturing back in, which the Apple announcements and yesterday about adding another 100 billion, so they're up to a $600 billion investment in the U.S. But also doing high security data centers. And Brian, I have been in some of those, which are stunning how tight the security is. But then working with skilled workforces and cybersecurity and getting AI incident response. Some of these data centers are going to be massive job producers, but the amount of water and electricity that it takes to get them built is pretty stunning, as we'll talk about a little later.
And the thing that I would throw out here at you, because I live in Tennessee, and even though Memphis is 375 miles away from me, it is in my own state. And so I do hear a lot about Elon Musk's massive X.AI data center in Memphis. And there's such a problem with getting electricity to it that they've been running methane powered generators there, the same methane that they use for the Starship launch. They also are using methane based generators in here to generate the electricity out there. And there have been some complaints from the locals about that. And so again, methane's just natural gas. But there have been some complaints and some concerns about that. Obviously this administration has a very different view of carbon than the previous administration did. And so it's interesting. Now, the good news about this AI infrastructure is that these small nuclear reactors seem to be just unstoppable at this point. There have been a number of designs that have been launched. Actually, one of the people that lives over the back fence from me in my home actually works on a nuclear reactor in Oak Ridge, where a lot of this stuff comes from. And it's a very interesting time because that's in here. Now, one of the major points in here on this AI infrastructure is they have significantly rolled back the regulations on permitting of AI data centers that exceed 100 megawatts. Okay. And 100 megawatts is a lot of data center. Okay. And it's basically the output of a pretty large power plant, maybe multiple large power plants. Okay. So it's a pretty healthy amount of data, pretty healthy amount of electricity we're talking about here. And so trying to figure out where these things can be built effectively and where we have all the infrastructure pieces needed, the connectivity, the electricity, the water to cool the data centers, and all those things in the massive quantities required is really a significant challenge. And so they're trying to go through here with this.
Yeah, so that being said, notice this is largely ignoring cryptocurrency changes and requirements as well. And the good news is the AICPA will have their blockchain symposium in October 7th, so we'll know more by then, I suspect. But this second pillar then I think illustrates a lot of the changes that are done on the infrastructure side. But the third is in diplomacy and security. Now, Brian, I know you carry a lot of, thinking about security. I like watching you present on it, but we both have kind of a cautious profile on AI security, just like we categorically make people aware of Intuit's position on AI and so forth. But what should we know about the third pillar here?
Well, realistically, we are going to have some limits on exporting of the technology in particular, as well as the chips in here. There are significant concerns because most of these chips are made by companies like TSMC that are in Taiwan. And, again, China believes that Taiwan is a renegade province that is an inseparable part of the whole of China. And so China wants to take over Taiwan, obviously. And if they did, it would have a huge impact on this. So America's trying to make significant investments in chips being built in the US. And I believe in the initial announcement for the action plan, they actually talked about more of the chips being built stateside as opposed to offshore, which is again a control thing in here. They also came up with some new controls for some of these semiconductor manufacturing systems. Basically, they got the Dutch companies the Dutch company that does the chip manufacturing tools to agree to not ship any of their latest generation technology to China, which is a pretty big deal here. They do have some national security evaluation and some biosecurity tools in here, and they're particularly pursuing some tools to prevent the misuse of AI in biology to, again, create AI based genetic engineering of bugs and things like that in here.
Yeah, and regardless of what you think of the origin of COVID, with the new variant, the Stratus, which is officially called XFG, that's spreading very rapidly again. But also even things like the chikunga, I can't say it right, chikungunya, mosquito virus, these type of bio things, they're very confusing. And here's the real formula as I see it. Using AI to fabricate bioweapons is a real deal. And so that in the wrong hands, I think, could be a problem, whether it's done by the US or done by China or done by some terrorist.
But the good news for us is that all of those drugs that AI promised to create, that were going to solve all of our health maladies, they haven't come to market yet. So maybe this thing that AI was going to solve with biologics and with medications and with genetic engineering, maybe it's a little harder than everybody thinks it is. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Well,
I don't
my old favorite saying from 2016. If you say it real fast, it sounds
know.
easy.
Yeah.
So there you
now,
go. But
now, uh,
any other key things though, Brian, on these, pillars? Because again, I want to talk a little bit about data center and security to wrap this session up.
well, I mean, realistically, I think the current president is more of a deal maker, and so I think you're going to see more brokering of deals and less of more deal driven policy as opposed to policy driven deals. So I think it's a I think that the strategy will evolve significantly as time comes on.
All right. Well, that said, then let's talk AI investment for just a minute, because Meta has announced that they're going to build a super data center called Hyperion in Indiana. It's going to be about the size of the island of Manhattan. The energy it consumes will be roughly the same as the country of New Zealand in a given year. So that's one hungry data center. They're also building a super intelligence lab, and they're hiring people with nine-figure salaries left and right.
Yeah,
Likewise, why?
the salaries have absolutely blown my mind. So many acqui-hires going on where Meta and others are hiring people away and paying just massive amounts of money to these people because it's clear that they see an existential threat to themselves in here, and they see an opportunity to drive that market cap enough that they can afford to pay somebody $1 billion. I don't know. It's an interesting time.
It is. And in fact, speaking of a salary, I think it's fascinating that, you know, AI engineers are rejecting compensation of $1.5 billion. Think about that for a minute. Hey, I'd like to pay a billion and a half. Do you mind working on this? Uh, I'm amazed how many people are turning down those offers. But
That's nice work if you can get it, I guess.
I guess so. Well, the Wyoming AI data center is another great example. This data center is estimated to take the same amount of power as all homes in Wyoming. So, it's not only a power thing, though. Out Wyoming way, as I recall, it's a little dry. And to cool these data centers, a lot of times you need water. So you've got both a water and power issue. And of course, OpenAI's Stargate project, which is, very extraordinary, $500 billion deal. There's already some contention around that. But according to Epic AI, they believe that the optimal investment in AI is much bigger than the current investment, estimated to be about 300 billion. Stargates would be next year. They think $25 trillion is needed to build these data centers. That, we're talking massive, massive amounts of money here.
Yeah,
So,
but you're trying to, that's something that's just not, you can't spin up that kind of spend that rapidly. I mean, there's just too much. You can't build, you can't, you've often said that, you can't plant you can't plant 60 acres of corn and end up with it in one day, as opposed to an acre of corn in 60 days. It's the same kind of thing here, that again, it just takes, some things just take a long time. And with the amount of infrastructure that's required for water and electricity, and again, the data centers themselves and the security of those and the workers and all the construction costs, because these things have to be super hyper secure, it's just, you just can't spend that much money that quickly.
yeah, understood. Well, we started this session with a little bit of a safety ranking on platforms, and I put Claude at the top of that list. And that's probably really a function of the constitution of Anthropic Claude and the guidance of Dario Amodei and others in their group. And there is a fair bit of concern about this, but Amodei contends that the power that AI bestows will be safer in the hands of a democracy like America than a autocracy like China. And he has cited that the relaxed exports of AI chips to China in response to NVIDIA's Jensen Huang's lobbying may be an enormous geopolitical mistake. Now, bottom line, friends, is Brian and I don't know. We just are watching this stuff, trying to say what the heck is going on. And I thought another interesting quote from Dario was that no bad person should ever profit from our success. And that's a pretty difficult principle to run a business on, but that's what Anthropic is doing right now. So I know you've watched a lot of this too, but any other comments here?
The thing I would say here is Claude seems to be gaining a lot of mind share, especially like you mentioned earlier around coding and in the enterprise. But again, it's still a very distant competitor to the leaders. So again, number one and two are still ChatGPT and Microsoft Copilot. And so it's, again, this is a market where there's going to be huge amounts of investment from huge amounts of different places, and there'll be a lot of people that want to get stupidly rich, and a lot of people will get stupidly rich. But it's going to take a while for the technology to evolve and then to consolidate into a number of offerings in here.
So, with that said, we just want to call out 4 ways that I think powerful AIs could go wrong. And this is from The Economist. It actually originated with Google DeepMind's April paper by Shane Legg. So he's the guy that's really behind this. And he flagged 4 powerful ways that AI could go wrong. And we've already talked about things like bioweapons or bombs or pogroms that could all happen. But we also want to call out that there are both America and Britain AI institutes, which formerly were called safety institutes, but they were renamed after J.D. Vance earlier this year said, we don't want safety. Okay, well, then we'll just be an AI institute, is really what happened there. But we are seeing some models like Grok's XAI, which was out for a couple of weeks and doing mischievous things, I would say, as well as OpenAI's ChatGPT, which was out for 2 weeks, encouraging people to kill themselves, for example. Both of those have happened in the prior 90 days of us recording this podcast. But the four key things that Shane Legg called out were misuse, misalignments, mistakes, and structural risks. And I think his view on this is actually pretty sane. I try to be logical about these things and I want everybody to profit and be successful, but I also don't want the bad guys to win. And so, I'm going to let you comment here for a moment, Brian.
And I think it's important here to also acknowledge that Grok is the Grok is the no boundaries version, the ultimate, the Ayn Rand, objectivist, do whatever you need to do kind of thing. And again, I mention that to you here because, with many of these, when you try to create deep fakes with world leaders in them, they will say, I'm not allowed to do that. Okay. Grok, on the other hand, will do things all the time. If you want to see a picture of, Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau kissing, it'll create it for you. Okay. And so this whole thing that we're talking about in here is that there are different approaches. Now, one thing I want to call out to you here is that we did not include Grok in the list of AIs for accounting. Okay. Because Grok is, well, I don't know. Grok is kind of the speed shop. Grok is to AI as a speed shop is to school buses. Okay. It's not that you don't want a school bus that can potentially go fast, but that's not the application you're solving for. Okay. And so Grok is, again, the XAI product in Grok. I think that's going to make a lot of interesting innovations in technology, maybe, but Grok is just not always suitable for work. And so we just have to acknowledge that and be aware that that's one of the design. It's not a bug, it's a feature. That's one of the design features for that product. And under no circumstances would I go near Grok with anything sensitive.
That's kind of an interesting comment on that platform, Brian. And I thought it was also interesting that Anthropic is attempting to license Claude to the federal government for $1. I don't know if the deal will get done or not, but that's kind of the positioning that they're taking. And in the big picture, this is an escalating war between these platforms, and they're kind of thinking it's going to be a winner take all. And right now we've got about 100 choices, and we're talking routinely about 4 or 5 of the dominant choices. And we covered the percentages at the beginning of this podcast, so you'd have at least some statistical basis of where the platforms are at right now. So all I want is everybody to be successful and the bad guys not to have as much access as the good guys. And for all of us that are practicing accounting, doing the best we can for our clients without compromising their information. So, Brian, any other parting thoughts for our audience today?
I think there is AI regulation. I think you're going to see less federal AI regulation than you've had in the past. I think the other thing that we have to just kind of bear in mind here is that we're going to have fewer guardrails than we would have had there been a Harris administration. And Trump is they're going to go hard at trying to win this thing. Okay. And it's, we're going to have some bumps and problems that we have to deal with. But again, it's, the difference in approach is that in the previous approach, it looked like they were going to effectively anoint 3 or 4 different things, and then they were going to make it hard for everybody else to compete with them. With this, it's an all out, no holds barred. It's not looking like the boxing match that the previous president wanted. It's going to look more like, a tag team octagon match beat to the death, so I guess it's going to be Fight Club. So I guess, I guess our chief regulator is going to be named Tyler Durden, I suppose.
Well, I hadn't thought about this as a wire cage match, but I guess that is possibility here. So I would be remiss, though, if I did not call out that a year ago, August 1 of 2024 was when the European Union AI Act went into force. And in countries around the world, there are AI regulations in place. So if you're doing business internationally, you may fall under those regulations. So for my CPA firms and businesses that deal internationally, I usually use the AI European Union Act as my guidance. And it's pretty sane. Sometimes the EU goes over the top, but what they ask there isn't over the top as I'd see it. And so I would be remiss if I wouldn't have called that out. So Brian, it's always a pleasure to talk with you on the podcasts here, and I hope you, our listeners, got to learn something new today. We appreciate you listening in, and we'll talk to you again soon on another Accounting Technology Lab. Good day.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. We'll be back next Saturday with a new episode of the Technology Lab from CPA Practice Advisor. Have a great week.